A common image of how governments operate is that the politicians come together in a room to make decisions that benefit the public by scrutinizing all the facts and options and picking the best way forward together, like a group of scientists looking for a cure to a social problem. That is, however, not at all how decisions are made in governments or the public administration. Many factors will impact what governments and high-level civil servants will take into consideration for decision-making, how those decisions are made, and what solutions will be applied to the perceived problems of the day. I am Professor Hellstrom, and this video series is a brief introduction to various theories explaining what forces shape how political decision-making is done. We will sort these theories based on the level of the analysis that the theories use, from the study of how individuals act, down here, through how organizations operate, to large-scale structures and how those affect and condition decision-making. And by structures, of course, things that everybody is immersed in, be it the economic system or a culture or how we think about common sense. In this video, then, I will explain what I mean by these levels of analysis. So I've designed this presentation here with these three levels of decision-making: micro-level, meso-level, and macro-level decision-making. And starting at one end, where we're looking at the smallest possible unit for analysis, and going up all the way to the structures. Micro-level. The micro-level focuses on individual behaviors, decisions, and interactions. For example, what affects the choices one person in a decision-making role makes. At the meso level, up here, we look at organizations and groups, such as political parties, government departments, public agencies, advocacy organizations, or corporations, to understand how their internal workings shape the outcomes of their operations. Finally, at the macro level, we zoom out to see the big picture, examining societal, economic, and cultural structures on national and global levels to see how they constrain choices for the actors immersed in those systems. This is where we explore trends like globalization, shifts in government ideologies, or the effects of climate change policies on a country. Together, these three levels provide us a layered understanding, helping us to piece together the puzzle of human activity and societal dynamics. Now, scholars often focus on one of these levels of analysis to the exclusion of the others. And there's been a long rivalry between the different resulting camps in the research. We call this the agency versus structure problem, the structure versus agency debate, where scholars who study an agency, they emphasize how individuals involved in decision-making arenas have a choice to make. They are just agents then. They have motivations, they have self-interests to achieve, and while there might be hurdles that stand in the way of making certain choices, they are not so great as to remove the individual as the primary actor in decision-making process. In this view, individuals, they have a lot of power to make their own paths, which makes it easy to explain how political change happens, but maybe harder to identify why change does not occur when it should. We have here then a focus on the actions and choices of an individual, how personal interests, psychological factors, and environmental constraints influence those political decisions, and incentivize people to act in certain ways. But there's no doubt that on the micro level, there is agency, and by agency, people can do things, and they can change things, right? So when we go back to this slide here, the core question, does history shape individuals, or do individuals shape history? And the agency side of this debate really will say that individuals do shape history. Who is in charge of a government? that person has a lot of influence because they can make decisions. This is the emphasis on individual choices and leadership. Leaders, activists, and policymakers, they drive change. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have professors who study structures. They will emphasize the hurdles confronting the decision makers by focusing on the constraints they operate in. For example, what are the economic relationships that a decision maker has to consider? Culture is another constraint. It's simply not possible to do certain things without incurring a backlash from the public. Politicians will also be limited by what is considered common sense. What does economic common sense of today say? It's simply hard, if not impossible, for politicians to imagine solutions outside what is considered common sense. So these professors then will argue that in this structural setting that we operate, common sense itself is a structure. And imagining a world outside the established common sense, even if you can, the backlash for trying to pursue it will probably cost the politician dearly, at least in a democracy. In a structuralist reading, then, it's easy to explain why things stay the same and why change is very difficult. You have a focus here on the systemic factors that influence governmental and institutional behavior. It considers this type of analysis the interplay between large-scale economic context and cultural norms that shape decisions. On the other hand, structural analysis will struggle with explaining how change occurs, as it's often seen that change might be very difficult, if not impossible. So it would seem to them, to these professors, that change is never going to happen because those structures are just so hard to offset. One example of that would be political economists who argue that most of the problems in the world come from the capitalist economic system. But they have very few suggestions, even if they would be right with that analysis, very few suggestions regarding how to end that system and replace it with something else. So this is the situation then for structure-focused scholars. They highlight the systemic constraints and historical forces and crises and economic shifts in institutions that create conditions for that change. In the structure analysis, individuals don't matter, or at least they don't matter a lot at all. They can't drive change. It's these big scale processes that drive change, and individuals are simply following the flow of those currents. Meso-level decision-making is a middle ground between these two. They focus on the interplay between organizations, groups, and political outcomes, and they examine how the structure and culture of organizations influence their internal dynamics and decision-making processes. An argument that maybe an individual can't make a change by themselves, but they can make allies, and together the organizations can make some changes. But those changes will also be constrained to some extent by what's happening outside and inside the organization, the infrastructure of the organization, the culture of the organization, and of course the other actors around the organization. So that is a quick introduction then to how we can discuss political decision making from the micro level to the macro level, understanding structures and this binding really and key debate that has been ingrained in political science as a topic of discussion for as long as these theories have existed. If you find this video useful, please take the time to like the video, press those subscribe and bell buttons so you get notified when new content is published. You can also support the channel by joining the community or supporting me on Patreon or Ko-fi. Every little bit helps. Thank you very much indeed.